First off, thank you for your patience. I know that it's been a lot to take in this morning, and there's been a lot of really good content and a lot of good questions too. So when we originally scheduled this IP symposium, we wanted to provide everyone with some of the basics, some of the understanding. What is a patent? How do we handle them here at Argonne? And we also wanted to give folks a flavor of how to engage with industry, because it is so important, as you saw from the clip from Rick Perry. And that includes sponsored research agreements. That includes working with our centers to really reach across the divisions and solve, cross-functional problems, those grand challenges. So we wanted to provide everyone with a little bit of an understanding as to, the mechanisms and the why. But we also wanted to provide folks with some success stories. You heard earlier this morning from Jeff Elam, more patents than most people will. Most patents at this point in his career, which is more than most folks would ever dream of having their whole career. So, very impressive. But we also wanted to provide some success stories on the entrepreneurship side. We wanted to give folks a chance to ask some questions of those individuals who have gone through the process and who have succeeded in really engaging with industry and making their mark, making their impact in the way that they wanted to. So before we get started, though, I know that we have a few of the panel collecting in the back right now. I did want to open it with just a few notes on entrepreneurship. So, what is entrepreneurship? A term that's bandied about quite a bit, and why are we here today to talk about it? And I think these are important questions that will really set the context for the whole discussion. So, a definition of entrepreneurship that I've come to adopt, an entrepreneur is a person who organizes and manages any new enterprise, especially a business, usually with considerable risk and initiative. So important in that definition is the word any. Entrepreneurship isn't just about forming a startup, going public, buying an island, and declaring yourself the next Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, or insert the appropriate superstar serial entrepreneur. Companies like Argonne, large companies today, actively foster entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking, so that innovation developed internally can make an impact. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. You saw the comment from Rick Perry, you saw the prime contract that Glenn went through. This is our mission. Our mission is to come up with great new ideas and to solve grand challenges. And that's our heritage too. It dates all the way back to the Manhattan Project. So entrepreneurial thinking means more than just a startup. It means getting out of your comfort zone to enable those innovations, to try something new, try something different. So over the last few years, we have seen an increase in programs directed at entrepreneurship. And these are some really great programs that have been funded by DOE. Energy I-Core, you may have heard of that as LabCore. Engineering Your Pitch, which is a new lab bridge project that's currently undergoing performance right now, a series of lunch and learns with some homework. Program Development Rotation. You're going to hear some more about this one. You're going to hear more about this one from John Harvey and Aaron Greco, the gentleman who managed it and one of the participants for our first cohort, our guinea pig of sorts. And then you also heard today about chain reaction innovations, and I think most of those folks have left us, but we're trying new things here at the lab. We're trying to get our impact profile higher, and there's great support within DOE, and there has been for a lot of these initiatives. But one of the challenges that we have is that these programs have been pilots, and these opportunities have come up in various ways. John Carlyle, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes, actually was a physicist who worked in our MSD division for a number of years, and then decided to go out and try it on his own, and created ADT, which is a company that still exists today. We're fortunate that John was successful and decided to come back and share that expertise with us here at the lab. But you'll see from the cross-section of speakers that we have this morning that entrepreneurship takes different forms. There's no one-size-fits-all, and that's the beauty of it. And what we wanted to do was demystify, provide some examples. Argonne is unique here in many regards, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about that today in terms of how we file patents, how we license patents, and that uniqueness extends to how we deal with startups and entrepreneurial activities outside employment. And because we are a federal facility, we are a government-owned, contractor-operated facility, we're stewards of taxpayer dollars. So we need to make sure And we've invested a lot of time and a lot of effort to make sure that our brand, our reputation, is one of independence and objectivity. And anything that would undermine that, we need to make sure that we deal with and we address. And so one of the beautiful things about this program here today is you're going to hear from some folks who went through that process, founded a startup, I should say, who went through a program development rotation, learned about engaging with industry. Other folks who've done consulting for startups or helped mentor startups. So there really are some great opportunities to learn. And along the way, we'll talk about the conflict of interest process, which I know many of you have heard about, and every year you fill out your ANL 135, which is your request for outside consulting, and you describe maybe there's an outside activity that you do. Maybe you have a dog walking business, maybe you want to create a startup. It really runs the gambit and anything in between. But we really are here today to talk about some of these great opportunities and talk to folks who've really done it. So before I turn it over, I just want to talk a little bit about. I want to talk a little bit about me. I just want to introduce myself. I'm Pete Sloniak. I'm one of 2 intellectual property attorneys here at the lab. In my prior practice, I represented all sorts of companies, from Fortune 500 drug companies to professional baseball teams to athletic equipment manufacturers. Since joining the lab, I've really emphasized my practice on patent and intellectual property licensing. So of the 100 or 200 privately sponsored research projects that we do every year, I will have my hand in at least half of those. And so in that, I've seen a lot of different businesses approach the lab, and they all have very different ideas as to what the lab can do for them and how we can add value. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And in the process of reviewing those agreements, I've had the distinct pleasure of working with all of the folks that will be here on the panel today. So they have seen it from both sides. They've seen it from the Argonne side. They've also seen it from the outside side. And that's great context. They really understand the confluence of different interests that we try to balance, we try to make work here. So joining me today as a co-moderator will be John Harvey. So John, why don't you come on up here today? So John actually has an interesting story. He joined TCP about a year ago in 2016, and he supports and helped found the program development rotation. And he also provides support as a business development executive for Argonne Design Works as well as the NST division. John has over 20 years experience as a global business development executive, identifying opportunities and projects from startups to multi-million-dollar businesses really throughout the world. He developed diverse businesses in solar, LED lighting and displays, flat panel LCD and plasma displays, nanostructure, microstructured optics, media storage, safety markets, and I'm running out of room on the page. And that's really in America, Europe, and Asia. John started Hadacon Solar and served as president and CEO. He ran the business development and function for Performed Line Products, Reflexite, and Fresnel Optics. He actually started his career at 3M as a test and product development engineer, and was selected for an entrepreneurial program development, very similar to sort of what he's running here today. So he has BS degrees, I should say, 2 of them, one in physics and one in mathematics from Illinois College, and a BS in electrical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis. So I'm very thankful that John is here today to help me co-moderate. I'm going to ask the other panelists to come on down. I know one of them, at least one of them, is coming from another building, but we are very, very lucky today. I had to pull a couple of strings to get Jack Gilbert here today. And Jack, to give you a little bit of background, 2 weeks ago I saw him, not in person, but I still saw and heard from him 4 times. I saw him twice on Chicago News for his recently published study on the microbiome of the University of Chicago Hospital. I also heard him on NPR in regards to a project he had started at the University of Chicago, and read about him in the paper paper in connection with one of the largest grants ever provided to a private university. So we're very lucky to have Jack here today. I really do want to thank him and all the panelists for taking time out. So a little bit about Jack to give him a proper introduction. Professor Jack Gilbert earned his PhD from Unilever and Nottingham University in 2002. He received his postdoctoral training at Queen's University in Canada. He subsequently moved to the UK in 2005 to Plymouth Marine Laboratory as a senior scientist until he moved to Argonne and U of C in 2010. Currently, Professor Gilbert is the director of the Microbiome Center and a professor of surgery at the University of Chicago. He is also a group leader for microbial ecology at Argonne, a research associate at the Field Museum, scientific fellow at the Marine Biological Laboratory, and the Yo Gim Sung Visiting Professor of Surgery at the National University in Singapore. Dr. Gilbert uses his molecular analysis to test fundamental hypotheses in microbial biology. 250 peer-reviewed publications. That is quite a bit. I thank him again for finding the time to join us here today. He also is the editor-in-chief of M Systems Journal. In 2014, he was recognized as Crane's Business 40 Under 40, and in 2015, he was listed as one of the 50 most influential scientists by Business Insider, and in the Brilliant 10 by Popular Scientist. In 2016, he won the Altmeyer Prize for the Surgical Infection Society and the W.H. Pierce Prize from the Society for Applied Microbial Biology for Research Excellence. He also has his fair share of startups that he's either been participating in actively or as an advisor. He is a founder and chief scientific advisor for Gusto, which focuses on using advanced systems biology modeling to design next generation of biological therapeutics. Chris Henry of Argonne is also involved in this company. The BioCollective is another company that he works with that is focused on stool biobanking and sample delivery for the microbiome research. You know, if I could draw an analogy, it's seeking to do with the microbiome what other companies like what is the name of that one? The genetic testing, 23andMe. Thank you, 23andMe has done. So very cutting edge stuff, and we're very fortunate to have him. Sitting right next to him is Aaron Greco, Principal Material Scientist in the Energy Systems Divisions, where his research interests include tribology, studying surface interactions, as it applies to wind turbine drivetrain reliability, vehicle efficiency, and advanced manufacturing, all very important and hot topics. Following a year-long detail at DOE headquarters in the wind power program, Aaron developed a sustained research program to address wind turbine reliability. He has 2 SPPs, 6 creatives, 6 journal articles, 1 patent, and 2 hosted industrial workshops to his credit since his return. Currently, Aaron is participating in cohort 1 of the program development rotation, leading a lab-wide initiative into metal additive manufacturing. In his spare time, we'll have to talk about that. Aaron is an amateur beekeeper and brewer, so we're going to have to explore that further, perhaps after 5 today. His advice for any new startup or entrepreneur activity is you can't be afraid to fail or get stung along the way to sweet success. So I think that's a great quote. Sitting next to Aaron is Dr. Ian Foster. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Foster, for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. So Dr. Foster, he's been with the lab for a very long time. He has, and you know, I can't begin to go through all of his accomplishments because I really do only have 45 minutes. But he has been the director of the Computation Institute, a joint institute between U of C and Argonne. He is a Argonne Senior Scientist and Distinguished Fellow, and the Arthur Holly Compton Distinguished Service Professor of Computer Science at the university. He specializes in methods and software, which those methods and software developed under his leadership underpin many large national and international cyber infrastructures. His awards include the Global Information Infrastructure GII Next Generation Award, British Computer Society's Lovelace Medal, R&D Magazine's an Innovator of the Year, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancements of Science, the Association for Computing Machinery, and the British Computer Society. He also was co-founder of Univa UD Inc., a company established to deliver grid and cloud computing solutions. He received a Bachelor's of Science from the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, and a PhD from the Imperial College in the UK, both in computer science. He also serves as a scientific advisor for some of the largest and fastest growing startups in Chicago that work in this big data field. So it is a privilege to have such an accomplished, credentialed, and frankly, innovative group here with us this morning. So we really do thank them. John Carlyle will also be joining us. He was on another panel for Q&A, and I won't take it as an insult that he's running a little late because, like these gentlemen, he is very popular, and we are so appreciative to have their time. So I've done a lot of talking. I'm going to take a 15-minute breath break, and I'm going to turn it over to John to get this kicked off, to start asking some of these innovators some questions. But before I do, what we really want to do is, again, highlight how innovation and entrepreneurship can happen here at the lab, and different ways that can occur, and programs that support it. And so we wanted you to learn from those that have done it, because it doesn't mean a whole lot coming from a lawyer. So with that, I'll turn it over to the true centerpieces here to get this kicked off, and John will get it started. And please think about some questions. He'll get them warmed up so that you guys can come right in. So thank you.
Thank you, Pete. And I'm just going to ask a couple questions to get them warmed up, and then I'll let the hounds attack. So that's the idea behind it all. But first and foremost, just to sort of get it started, what really sparked your initial interest in entrepreneurship? How did you even get started in this thought process that I like this concept? Jack?
So from my perspective, I actually have training. Did my PhD with Unilever, major product manufacturer and conglomerate, and I got very excited about the idea of translating the science, the basic science that I was doing, into something that could have societal impact. In fact, at that time, I was working on proteins which could bind onto ice and prevent it from over-crystallizing, which you could struggle to find a solution for that, maybe cryogenics. Well, Unilever wanted it to make ice cream taste smoother, which was a noble cause in my imagination. And I saw that opportunity. My name got on several patents. I got no money from it entirely. They now use that product in Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So, and I have no value because I signed away my life as a PhD student at the age of 21. And so that taught me two lessons. Number one, it's quite exciting to translate science. Number two, you really got to read the fine paperwork, and also have a much better fundamental understanding of intellectual property and what it actually means, right? So I've dedicated a lot of the last 7 years of my career to trying to develop strategies to improve the rate and transmission of therapeutic technologies associated with microbiome for medicine and for environmental strategies. And so we've done a lot of work with the community to overturn that. But yeah, I just love translation.
So I guess in my experience, entrepreneurship kind of came secondary. It was more restlessness and curiosity that drove me to my initial experiences, and that was, doing research in a topic area and just being curious about other avenues to take my research. And to do that, you have to kind of develop your own program if you want to get the money to do the work, right? So for me, it was just having the curiosity to kind of go after that next topic area, and then finding the avenue to get that money. So we were starting kind of at zero essentially, and having the courage to ask for some very small seed money from the lab. I think it was $5,000 to help co-sponsor a workshop to get Argonne's name associated with it. And then from that, we gradually built a name, got a reputation with the sponsoring program agency, and then eventually led to a sustained program around it. And since then, leading to the program development rotation, I guess my restlessness came again and kind of led me down that path. And I think for me, it's always trying something new, not being afraid to kind of get outside yourself and do something you're not comfortable with. So essentially, that's it.
Yeah, my own involvement in entrepreneurship in the sense of commercial activities it's always been somewhat accidental in that we've developed tools, methods and tools for use in science, and then companies come and want to use it as well, and we're not really set up to support them. And so Univa and a more recent company I'm involved in, Predictus Climate Solutions, both have this goal of supporting people outside the usual science and engineering space to use tools that we've developed. Certainly my experience is that based on that, I've never been the CEO, the prime driver. I've been a co-founder and a advisor and somewhat participant, and in both cases it's a lot of work to make something succeed. The first one ultimately I would say didn't succeed, although we learned a lot. That was Univa, the Predictus Climate Solutions. We'll see how that works out. You need someone very dedicated to pursue these things and do a lot of, I think, often very dull work because you believe in what is involved.
And this is John Carlyle. You've heard his name bandied about throughout the day as the interim director for Chain Reaction Innovations. So I wanted to say thank you to John for joining us, and perhaps John, the other John, if you could repeat the question to give John a little bit of catching up time.
Thank you so much for doing that.
No, I just wanted to see how you're going to do, but
Just ask the same question that you asked them.
no, the question is what really sparked your interest in entrepreneurship from the beginning? When did you sort of see that initial spark that, hey, this is something I want to pursue from an entrepreneurship standpoint?
Oh, boy, it's hard to give a short answer to that, honestly. I don't know, everybody knows, but I spun off a company, Advanced Diamond Technologies, in 2003. And at that time, I had very personal reasons that were driving me to do this. One was just fundamental professional growth. We had made a lot of interesting discoveries in the basic science of how to put together nanocrystalline diamond films. And there was just a universe of applications that emerged immediately. And it was hard at the time, as it is today, to take a BES-supported program and start doing all that stuff. We did that to some extent. We brought in money, but to really flesh out the technology and to see it grow, thinking entrepreneurially in the context of this discussion, doing a startup was kind of immediately emergent. Part of it was just becoming very fascinated with translating the technology into the market. I'd written a lot of papers at the time and written those first paragraphs about how wonderful diamond is and how it's really useful maybe for certain applications. I really actually wanted to go down that path of seeing if I could take the lab discoveries and get involved in product innovation, of imagining what sort of impact the technology would have in things like artificial retinas and pump seals and a diamond pancreas and some of the more exotic stuff that we explored over the years.
You sort of, how has your pursuit of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurism, which is very difficult to say, how has that impacted you from a career standpoint? How would you look at how that's impacted your career?
Oh, well, it's the road less traveled makes all the difference story. I mean, like a lot of you in the room, you get a typical STEM-based education, PhD. You're very good at doing basic research and writing papers. What this done for me career-wise is expanded that along the business axis. So just from a professional development perspective, it's had an enormous impact, because not only do I see how to do the basic research and the fundamental discovery, but I can play that out across the full spectrum to the point of manufacturing, scalability and getting somebody to actually buy something from you. It's really hard to learn that at the end of the day, it's not about the diamond. It's either two primary forces, fear or greed. People buy something from you because they're fearful that somebody else is going to do it, or they're greedy. They see how to make money. Those are very different universes, and for good or ill, my brain is able to stretch in both of those dimensions sometimes simultaneously.
Well, for me, I think I like building things, and so you need to be entrepreneurial to raise the funds to build things and demonstrate that things work. And then if you're successful, then well, maybe some fame follows. Not usually much fortune in my experience, but.
And I guess my experience is more, what was the term, intrapreneurial? Entrepreneurial. So it's all been internal to Argonne, and for me, I think the timing's been really great because the program with the program development rotation has really provided the opportunity to do the things I was looking to do, and it's provided the resource and the access to areas of the lab I would not necessarily have without that kind of program. And it kind of exposed me across the lab, and I've gotten to learn a lot more about the lab and where the potentials are.
One final comment on that. I diversified my research portfolio specifically because I saw the benefit of the basic research. A lot of the neat ideas that developed into companies or into patents that we licensed out were based on insane ideas that had no basis in reality and were just like looking at one tiny little aspect of something and trying to do something about it, right? And so I still like to maintain that. I still have fundamental interest in the development of fundamental science, but I now actually target some of our research areas towards growth in more applied settings. So what are the areas where we could have the low-hanging fruit, right? Where we could have real impact really fast towards the development of a patent, which would then be applicable for licensing or company development. And so, most of my career over the last 7 years has been focused on developing that and building the framework that would allow us to actually have that innovative capability. So the Polsky Center at U Chicago and Argonne, right, is a representation of that. I mean, they've taken microbiome to heart, and they care deeply about innovation in that space and about enabling it. So I've spent a lot of time making sure that my career is focused on making sure that they are passionate about it, right? So that's a lot of education there.
I guess I have a follow-up question to that to Aaron and Ian. How has your venture into entrepreneurship changed how you view your research here at the lab?
Yeah, I mean, I guess prior to that, I've been very focused in a specific area, and doing this new program development, I've kind of had to take myself outside of my norms and my comfort zones and look into wildly different areas of things that cover machine learning and exascale computing and things like that initially are very kind of uncomfortable for me because it's not something in my background, but just being a scientist engineer, I'm always eager to learn, and I think it's a great opportunity to kind of learn something new and kind of take it and run.
I guess I've realized that getting money from DOE is not the only way to grow something. So, and some of my colleagues at the moment are engaged in companies where they're seeking to raise money from SBIR and other sources from commercial directions in order to take things they've developed at the lab and scale them. So I think that's something I wouldn't have, when I first joined Argonne, certainly that wasn't something that ever occurred to me.
Good points, especially with change in priorities that comes with any change in administration. Understanding just where the opportunities are is so critical. I guess a follow-up question for the whole panel. What have you learned about the importance? This is an intellectual property symposium. What have you learned about the importance of intellectual property to being entrepreneurial, to engaging with industry?
People like ideas. There's greed. You pointed that out earlier, right? Mostly when the people in industry come to my door, they want to drain my brain, literally, and they'll pump you full of questions and ask you as much as possible to try and find out the thing that they need without ever having to pay for it, right? And I learned very early on in my career that I could charge them a lot of money to consult on their problems, right? But I also learned very quickly that any innovation that was ongoing in my lab or in my greater sphere of influence was needed to be protected from those individuals. And most companies are actually very good at preventing that from happening and, and closing their ears when necessary. But there is also always the concern that when you're talking to somebody like that, that you need to be very fundamentally aware of what IP actually is and how to protect it. I mean, as a student, I got stung, right, for not understanding that. Now, I go to great lengths to make sure that when the other professors in my domain or the other researchers here at Argonne in my domain, when they talk to a company, that they know exactly which aspects of what they're talking about they should be not talking about. Or gardening around protection. So we push very carefully for invention disclosure very rapidly so that they can see what it is about that intellectual property which needs protecting. And then engagement with lawyers, right? I mean, it's amazing. Why would you? But
Why wouldn't anyone want to talk to a lawyer is the question for the panel.
But, engagement with you guys to make sure that they understand. I think there needs to be a lot more education in IP and what it stands for and what the preposition is. I've worked in industry before, outside of Unilever, and we got constant IP education, which we do not get here. And that needs to be changed dramatically. The other element is engagement with a broader array of people so that we have a better understanding of what the IP is. I mean, this is a very male-dominated panel. We could have selected other entrepreneurs, of either a minority group or a female persuasion that would be actually possible to represent that up here. And so those kinds of things would be massively advantageous towards the development of IP at Argonne especially. So it's just my soapbox.
Just on that last point, one of the 5 cohorts for chain reaction has a female participant, but in general it'd be a lot better if there were more underrepresented groups sitting up here. So one of my mandates is to improve the diversity of our program and try to attract more of females and others in those groups. They want to be entrepreneurs and to want to be innovators to have the support they need. So just wanted to do that quick comment. I guess the question was, what's the downside, or roughly speaking? If you're a scientist, you make your career based on impressing people how smart you are. And so you typically want to gush about everything you can think of with anybody. You go to a conference and you're sort of judged on your ability to do that. When you start talking to industry, it's a totally different dynamic. You don't want to tell them everything you know. And typically scientists undervalue their knowledge greatly in those conversations. So one of the hardest things for me to learn personally when I started wearing the hat of CTO of ADT is both that, just being very guarded and careful about intellectual property and not disclosing everything you know, understanding the value of not telling them something in terms of getting your industrial potential customer actually even more interested in what you're doing, not less. Ancillary to that is never give it away for free. Your impulse as a scientist is to do a lot of collaborative work where you're doing something and your collaborator does something. There are certainly success stories working with industry along those lines, but my hard learning is most of the time it doesn't work. And part of the subtle point there is when you give it away for free, no matter what you do going forward, you've already undervalued your product, your value to that customer, no matter what you do, no matter how you try to correct it later on. Those are some of the, I wouldn't say downsides, they're just part of the learning of the cultural difference between discovery science versus, building business value.
I had a mentor many, many years ago in Silicon Valley that was a serial entrepreneur, started many, many tens of companies. And he always told me the great thing about startups is you never learn what to do, you just learn what not to do the next time. So I'd like for you guys to impart a little bit of wisdom on the folks out here that may be thinking about sort of going down that entrepreneurial path of, what's a lesson learned, or what's something you could help them, a quick little bit of information to help them to ideally not make the same mistakes. They can make a whole different list of them.
You need to make the mistakes, right? I don't think anything we say up here would change that facet. I think my fundamental error was going in and not compartmentalizing myself more within a particular entrepreneurial avenue. So I started a company, 3 years ago, and I signed a document that basically said that anything I do in this space should be under the purview of that company, right? And I've even signed consulting agreements which I've had to finagle my way out of that have had similar kinds of language. And that's just a case of understanding. As you said, understand that business value proposition that the company wants to derive from that knowledge and that information. If you don't, you will do yourself a disservice, right? And that's all about education, 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 education. Learning what it is that you have and how valuable it is, and then making sure that you understand that you can put bounds around it. I've launched 3 companies now, and we have a new one about to come out, and they all have microbiome as the center, right? Because that's all I do. But I can compartmentalize them. I can identify how to strategically place my specific knowledge in this organization and still have its capacity for growth unmitigated, right? So, and that is difficult, but it's a learned proposition. And I think anybody we talked about a serial entrepreneur, tens of companies, a lot of his intellectual property was probably spread out across those organizations. And that is a difficult thing to manage. But it's a thing you have to learn. And the first thing is read. Read everything anybody gives you, and don't just flippantly sign it and assume they're good-natured, because a lot of people are not.
One thing I'll add, I think when you're in the initial stages of it and you're trying to define your value proposition, and you're engaging with external stakeholders, take the time to learn and listen. I think we typically, as scientists, as John was saying, we want to, prove that we know everything. We don't know everything, and we don't know what all the, especially in the industry, what their real problems are. So you can gain a lot by just asking questions, listen. Even if you do know a little bit of those answers, hold that back, because that is your value proposition in the end, and just learn as much as you can through that process.
I'd say one book that I found. I think myself and my colleagues continue to find very relevant is this Crossing the Chasm. Some of you may have come across this. It has a lot of good lessons about how to proceed when you're out there with a new technology and you're trying to find a way to make it ultimately profitable. What sort of customers to go after, how to focus, why it's important to focus, things like that. Otherwise, lessons learned or mistakes made. With Univer, I think we ended up we were very excited. We got some VC support. I don't think they were very good VCs. They were sort of local Chicago people. Maybe that's a problem. I'm not sure. In my area, which is computing, a lot of activity happens really on the 2 coasts. They ended up, the classic series of things. They come in, they put in a CEO who didn't know what he was doing. So don't let that happen to you, I guess, is the lesson. I don't know how we would have done better at the time. But and then the other thing, it's very important to be lucky with your timing. I think that's, you want to come out with the new technology just when the market is ready for it. Don't come out a year too early. That's a bad thing to do. So.
Yeah, for Diamond MEMS devices, we were a couple of 3 years too late. So that was one of my regrets. That was one of the things that lit me up personally about doing Advanced Diamond, is the thought of enabling Diamond electronic devices. And we just missed the boat by 2 or 3 years, really, in getting into that game. But overall, the main message is don't be afraid of mistakes, because I made a ton of them. But to me, they're not things I regret. They're points of which I was able to learn. The favorite story I tell over and over again is when I was on the phone with Gillette and I told him I could make a razor blade last forever. I was really proud of myself when I told him that. And the business guy in the room, Neil Kane, was frowning. I mean, I was like, what did I do? But that's how I learned the razor blade business model is through actually making the mistake of telling $1 billion company that I could put them out of business with my technology. And I didn't understand why they didn't like that. Make mistakes. Part of the overall sort of background here is we're trying to foster entrepreneurial thinking in a much more general way at the lab. So taking risk and not being afraid of making mistakes is integral to not just doing startups, but program development and helping the lab fulfill its mission better by growing the lab. So I'll just stick with that message. Mistakes are vital, and they can be actually, in the end, core part of your understanding.
And to build on one point that Jack had raised originally, education is so important to understand what it is that you're getting into. Recently, about 2 months ago, Argonne, with Suresh and a group of other volunteer firefighters, we put together a series of web pages on our internal Argonne website about entrepreneurship. And, some of it is providing reference materials, and a lot of these are books. Actually, one of them he had mentioned, Crossing the Chasm, by Geoffrey Moore. There's a list of books up there, and what we decided to do was we reviewed syllabi from the University of Chicago's Business School, Harvard Business School, MIT, Stanford, and we said, what are people who are teaching entrepreneurship classes giving to their students to educate them? And so we wanted to provide, in some way, shape, or form, our own internal Argonne syllabi. So you want to be an entrepreneur. And so there's a list of about 8 or 9 books. I've read all of them. They're all very good reads. Even if you're only looking to kill a warm Sunday afternoon, it's a great read. But there's also references in there about startups, about whether it's incubators or whether it's incubators if you want to go on the outside, or working with Argonne centers, SPPs, CREDAs, informational material to help make you more well-armed. And one of the things that we'll get into in a few minutes here is also conflict of interest, because when you do found your own company, it's important, as Jack said, to compartmentalize, to know where you're going, what knowledge goes with what project, and keeping those boundaries helps everyone in the long run. And so it takes a little time to get used to that notion. It takes a little time to set up the fence line, but once you do, everyone knows clear what the expectations are. So
Can I make a point around that? As I said, in the companies I've worked for, IP training and education is mandatory because it's really important. The IP is really important. I think we massively undervalue the IP position of this institution. University of Chicago did it as well, right? And now starting to change their mandate. Massively undervalue it by not mandating proper training, right? It needs to be done. And there's a case in point to this. There's a huge activation energy to identifying your own IP. If you're not used to doing it, if you're not used to looking at the results coming across your table or coming through your computer, you can't identify it. Most people just don't know what they're looking for, and it's a problem that needs to be nipped in the bud. We're really, really super serious about training in virtually every other facet of our lives here at Argonne, as we all know to our constant irritation, right? This is one thing that would be really, really valuable, for not just for the individuals, but for the lab. How do you identify intellectual property? I don't know if anyone else has got a comment on identifying intellectual property, but it's a key thing.
I agree.
So in the software business, things are somewhat different, I think. Perhaps trade secrets are more important than, I don't know if you were talking about patenting things. But could be, yeah. Yeah, you're probably right. And I did have a couple of hours this week which I'm not using for training, which aren't filled up with training courses. So another one will be good. Yeah.
But that's between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. What are you going to do with
I
that?
don't know how to react to that. How many people here, professional summaries at the end of the year include intellectual property development? Ooh, 1. 160 patents. Nice. Well, there's work to be done to kind of align all interests, right? So when I was here, I didn't get any credit for patenting. I got all the credit for publishing papers and making us look good in the third-year reviews for BES. That was my focus. So it's a challenge. You've got to line up the institutional interests with your day-to-day, what you need to do in order to advance professionally. So. But IP is super important. There's no way to underemphasize it. It's also pretty frustrating because it can go from infinite positive to infinite negative value, especially in a startup where dollars are precious and you've got to make a decision about, whether you file internationally. And if you're going to do a PCT, it's going to be tens of thousands of dollars of cost, even if you use cheap consultants instead of a very glorious New York-based law firm. But it's vital to growing value. It's the first step. If you're going to do a startup, it's sometimes really the only value you got. The only reason that you're going to get those nice VC, I'm not sure if there is a nice VC, by the way. The only way you're going to get investor money, they're going to look at this and, they're not going to want to hear the story that they spend millions of dollars on your technology only for it to be not protected and some other company can just go and run with it. So if you are going to do a startup, it's sort of mandatory to have some sort of protection. Not just IP, but trade secrets, although the lab can't do trade secrets, if I remember correctly.
That is correct. So part and parcel of our prime contract is that everything we deliver to the DOE, federal facility, federal dollars, is delivered to the United States government and therefore the people of the United States with unlimited rights. Federal government paid for it out of taxpayer funds. It should be to the benefit of the people. And really, it wasn't until the 1980s when Congress passed the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed universities and nonprofits receiving federal funds like the lab to be able to file a patent, own the intellectual property that comes out in that regard. But it is important because without that intellectual property protection, it is hard to garner interest of commercial entities to figure out exactly what it is that we have to offer them of value beyond just our services, beyond just a completed report.
Yeah, not just in the startup context. Program development and in general industrial interest in working with the labs is often predicated on whether they can accrue the value of their investment in a way that's protected.
In picking up on that last point, the DOE system is different, and it's different for a number of reasons. And I guess my question is really directed towards Ian and John. You two both had startups coming out of Argonne, and if I recall correctly, both of them were based in some part on Argonne intellectual property. Could you talk a little bit about that process and how spinning out of a lab might be different than spinning out of a university?
Oh boy, okay. Very spicy meatball. In my case, there were 14, I lose count, it's been so many years, about 14 patents that were pertinent to what we wanted to do. At the time, it was still a pretty novel idea to do a spin-off startup company, and it was even more novel to think about licensing all of those patents in all fields of use to one little startup. And there was a lot of drama associated with that I won't get into, but it took a lot of work. It took over a year to sort of line up what the business model for that company is and to make the business case internally all the way up to DOE headquarters through the University of Chicago to do that. So it was challenging. I don't know what else you want to know. It took a long time. We were successful, though, and I will say the value of that was immense. I mean, we talked about the value of IP to the startup. The fact that we had all that exclusively in nearly all fields of use, except one minor one, and it was an Argonne technology with tens of millions of dollars of investment from the government over many years. That automatically set us apart from your garden variety, sort of academic-based startup that you typically see today. So.
Yeah, and my situation was quite different in that the software we formed Univa to basically provide support, commercial support for, was all open source. It was freely available, and that was an important part of our value proposition inside the lab system and inside research and education. That's why we got so many people to adopt it in science. But I'd say it was certainly an obstacle to raising funding when it came to forming a company. I don't know whether I don't think it mattered whether the customers didn't really care. I think they actually liked the fact that it was open source because they saw there was a community of people that were contributing to it, but it probably did lower the value for a VC.
Comment. I make one comment on that. You know, we talk about the university versus Argonne, right? For example, like, you know, we're part of the parcel of the same group, but you know, the university used to be really bad at commercializing IP, right? They and I think a lot of it is because they didn't take the time to understand the IP positions of their faculty. That's been turned around in the last decade, much due to the leadership of President Zimmer. But there's been a renewed interest in the development of intellectual property to put, you know, UChicago is a place for thought, right? Not for action. And we're now changing that paradigm to a certain extent. And Argonne needs to embrace that as well. And Argonne, as an organization, is very similar to a big company. Like you take your Procter & Gamble or your Unilever, right? There's enormous amounts of IP developed constantly, every single day, and people patenting, provisionally, you know, protecting their you know, interests on a constant scale. And 99% of that intellectual property doesn't ever get developed, right? Because it just sits there. You know, we got it, it's protected, we don't have to worry about it. And so there's actually a bunch of companies are now coming up, and I'm visiting one of them on Friday, that are working with large organizations to identify their trove of intellectual property and start to build frameworks for spinning out, to a certain extent, that intellectual property into subsidiary organizations. I think we need to be more innovative in how we handle it once we've got it, right? And not just rely upon the individuals to foster and develop that, but there to be much greater support and development for that inside Argonne. UChicago's got the Polsky Center now, right? And they actually partner up individuals that are interested in this development. So business types out of the school, or you know, or with the scientists, and say, well, how do we build a company here, right? Not relying on the VCs to tell us what to do. And Argonne could do this as well. It would be a real strength. I know I sound like I'm constantly saying, well, this is what we should do, but I am always frustrated by the necessity for further engagement and continuous engagement and development. And we could do a lot by looking at, you know, the guy just walked out, 160 patents, you said, right? That's, sorry, you're like, we're going to talk about you while you're gone. Sorry. But 160 patents. How many of those have been commercialized, right? And how many other patents exist in our portfolio that haven't been touched? And what could be done if we revisited some of that intellectual property and said, hey, this could be developed and spun out? And Argonne should be more proactive at that.
We've done a lot of questions. We've asked a lot of questions up here. So how about questions from out there?
I have a related question because I've been wondering, you know, the lab patent's only a fraction of the inventions that are filed. And one could imagine a lot of scenarios, I mean, obviously there's pressure that you want to protect IP as quickly as possible. And then the other question is addition of value. And one can imagine a lot of values where it makes total sense to patent them all. And you could imagine situations where it doesn't pay off and situations where it does. Is there any kind of statistical modeling to look into that, what actually makes sense, whether to patent them all or just patent a fraction? But of course, the follow-through is a key aspect of that modeling as well.
It always bemuses me when I talk to some of these large companies who have a lot of stuff patented, a lot of stuff filed, right, that they don't do that kind of intellectual modeling, right? They don't sit down with a statistician and go, well, how could we generate more value here? And create streams of innovation with inside the company or external that would enable them to achieve that, right? Because if you get hooked into the machine, the company itself is so impossibly massive and incapable of moving that it's an impossibility to drive anything forward. And Argonne has that problem, right? It's too big and too interconnected to develop intellectual property on that scale and identify the components of your portfolio of IP that could be valuable, you need to think on your feet, you need to be nimble and light and scrappy, right? And you need to fundamentally have, as you said, a modeling framework which tells you which components of that portfolio could be more appropriate for development. And we need that. Yeah, we need far more funding going into helping us to develop that space. That's just my pitch for you guys.
I think it's a great point. One of the issues that we always come across is that we have a finite budget for, I think you saw 180 plus inventions per year, or at least this last year, and only so many of those we can file a patent application on. And so one of the things, so over the years, we've worked with a number of partners to do these types of analyses, to do the, whether it's partnering with an outside entity, perhaps through a subcontract, or perhaps another lab, or perhaps a university. We've tried a few of these things, but I do think that it's always, when we have a dynamic research portfolio, it's always important to revisit these, and it's always important to understand that we have plenty of opportunities out there, and it is a matter of identifying the ways that we can make the most impact, and what is the area in which we can put our efforts in order to really maximize our finite budget. And so I certainly echo everything that's been said here, that there is so much more impact that the labs could be making. And part of it is inherent structure and inherent frictions that come along with that. Part of it is budgetary, and part of it is that we simply work at a very basic science institution, and so it's so important that folks, again, get trained, that they understand exactly what it is that they're dealing with and the value of it, and they don't undersell it. So I think that we've tried to institute some safeguards to have IPDGs before publication. The PANDA system you may be familiar with is the pre-review for publication, important things like export control, as well as intellectual property, to see if we can capture value at their source. So I certainly think that there's room for improvement, and there's more every day our chief patent counsel sees a great new invention that has the potential to really be game changing, and I think that it really does come down to our mission to be impactful. So
just real fast. Argonne's not like a big company, all right? So there's certainly a lot of thinking about how Argonne can function more like a big company tactically. But what I would encourage the individuals here is to embrace the problem statement, if you will, from the ground up, from you. There's nothing like the value you're trying to impart to developing an IP portfolio that's tactically constructed in a way that builds maximal business value is hard and expensive to do. And for practical purposes, I turn the question back to myself. If you feel like you've made a discovery in the lab that could be meaningful from a business perspective, you're the first best person to start asking those questions, really. Not without guidance, not without help from the folks here at Argonne, but as just a practical matter, that value that you're trying to impart, here it's going to be, I think, more effective to think about you and how you can move the needle on that. Having the organization do it from the top down tactically is something else that also we probably should do a better job at, but just my 2 cents.
See, in regard to getting involved in something like entrepreneurship, and this is something new to us, and in terms of conflict of interest, what can we do and what can we not do? Without risking our job here.
No, that is a good question. And we have the room for another 3 minutes, so I'm going to fully address all aspects of that. But I think it's important to say that the bottom line is that when someone comes to Argonne and wants to do outside work, they fill out their 135, and then it goes through this approval chain. And if there is an issue around intellectual property, conflict of commitment, say time commitment, we try to address it. But the simplest, most straightforward answer to that is that it's about getting buy-in buy-in from your boss, buy-in from your program manager, buy-in from perhaps the relationship manager with the department in DOE or the organization, because what we want, the conflict of interest is fundamentally where your interest is potentially or actually different from the lab's. And so we need to make sure that, one, the lab's interests aren't being undermined, and two, that we are not doing anything that would give off the appearance of favoritism. Because this part goes back into Argonne being an FFRDC, a GOCO. We have, there are added restrictions on what we can do, and they're baked into our prime contract. So it's important, because we are so high profile, and because especially in licensing, we're so outwardly facing, that we keep everything above board so that it doesn't even give the appearance of some sort of improper conduct. So that could be, fairness of opportunity, that could be posting the technology, removing a PI from a particular project. But again, it goes back to the first point, which is it's very fact dependent and it requires buy-in. If you would take a look, and I encourage anyone who's thinking about this to go check out the Entrepreneurship webpage. There's actually a subpage on conflicts of interest, and it gives 3 case studies. One where, very similar to Ian's situation, where it's open source software, another one where perhaps somebody wants a patent license on a non-exclusive basis, and a third one where perhaps somebody wants to exclusively license a suite or portfolio, as John did with ADT. And it walks through some of the checks and balances that may be baked into the situation. And this negotiation gets baked down into a plan, which then, in many cases, needs to be approved by the Department of Energy. So the long and the short of it is, it's about balancing interests, and that requires some negotiation. If you have a specific situation in mind, I encourage you to check out that webpage, or ask those folks who've done it. Great resources up here, great resources. Inside Argonne. And that was 3 minutes, so I think, Suresh, maybe one more question from Suresh.
If you will, you've all done this and you've done it successfully. The researchers here in the audience that are thinking about this, do you have a recommendation, the things they should think about before they, that will help them decide if they take the plunge or not, especially in the context of the here. Any recommendations, any suggestions, things to do or not to do?
Yeah, you mentioned asking a question of yourself, right? If you ask a question of yourself about what that piece of information that you've just generated, what it means and if it's valuable, okay, that's the first stage. If you think it is, then you have to ask a question of yourself. And I think you said, you're a basic scientist, right? And you launch yourself into a program of research that moved over to the dark side, the Darth Vader reference. I love Star Wars. And it's a big leap, right? You don't want to be. It's also an interesting ideological leap into a situation where you're trying to commercialize and financially benefit from the products which you've been working on for a while, and it's sometimes a struggle to balance that in your mind as to the benefits and the disadvantages of it. And it's a very different world. They speak a very different language, so you've got to know that this is something you want to get into as a scientist, when you could be probably using that time more effectively for doing actual research. So I think it's an ideological issue as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I would say from the entrepreneurial perspective, don't be afraid to look at what resources are available to you from the lab. And it doesn't have to be the program development rotation. It could be going directly to your division director and say, hi, I have this idea. Everyone has program development funds. Don't be afraid to ask for them. Pitch your idea. They might help you refine that idea, but don't be afraid to ask for help.
I really don't think there's any downside, to be blunt about it. Just as one example, I was really worried, like a lot of scientists, is when you stop publishing, you start doing the business stuff. In reality, as an ADT, my publication rate stayed almost the same as it was in Argonne for many years. Go look me up on ResearchGate, and I was active up until just a year or two ago when I dropped off a little bit. So that's just one aspect of it. But look, there's enormous support systems in place for you, and even if you start down this road and you decide this is just not for you, you're still going to learn something valuable. At the end of the day, I think the winds of change are here, and industrial sort of illumination of what you do. Why is what you're doing in basic research important to the world around you? Is something that cannot hurt you as a scientist. And I would contend that knowing more about that will not only help you to maybe help to commercialize or translate your technology towards commercialization, but it will help you do basic research. And that was one of the inherent fears that I had starting this, is just a cultural thing of, if you start going down the business axis, you're never coming back, and you're distorting yourself, and there's the value of unfettered thought, of not having, you know, your day-to-day thoughts about what you do in the lab. You know, sort of the immediate payback is a distraction and somehow inferior to, you know, having the privilege of just doing basic research. That shaped a lot of my early thinking, but in retrospect, it shouldn't have. There's much more positives than negatives when it comes to letting that into your world of thinking about what you do as a scientist.
Well, thank you, well, first off, thanks to the panel. Thank you for taking time this afternoon. With that, I think we're beyond the 12:30 targeted end time by only just a little bit. So thank you, everyone, for coming and spending the morning with us in the early afternoon. We do appreciate you coming out to the 2017 IP Symposium. Thank you again, and everybody have a great day.